So there's this very famous little story about philosophy and how the study of philosophy can change your life. Plato's Socrates tells this story in this book, The Republic. You may have heard it or heard about it. It's called The Allegory of the Cave. Socrates says, imagine a cave, and at the bottom of this cave there are prisoners. And they're chained, their feet and their necks are chained. And these prisoners spend their whole lives staring at the back wall of this cave. All they can see are shadows of things, people, animals, moving back and forth across the cave wall. But then one of these prisoners is let loose. So he's able to climb up and out of the cave. And as he ascends, he finds these puppeteers who are standing in front of a fire and using statues or puppets to project the images on the back of the cave. So he comes to understand that these things that he's been staring at his whole life are just images. They're nothing but shadows. It's just these people using puppets and statues to project a spectacle onto this cave wall. And what this person thought was a dog was really just a shadow of this statue of a dog. And then this guy climbs up higher, up and out of the cave into the real world, where he sees like the things themselves. He sees like a real dog. So he comes to realize that the shadow was just an imitation of the statue, and the statue is just an imitation of the real dog. And this prisoner who's made his way out of the cave would think of his old life, and he'd think of it with shame and contempt. He would likely be embarrassed to realize that those things he once thought were real, that made up his whole world, were simply shadows. Now, for millennia, people have understood the allegory of the cave to be a story about philosophy. This story about being imprisoned in a cave and deluded by shadows until you escape and ascend and see the light and the truth of reality and see the world as it really is. This is what it's like to study philosophy. I think what attracts a lot of people to philosophy is this sense that through philosophy, you can access the truth. I think we all have this sense that we're not being told the whole truth. We get this sense from our parents, from authority figures, from people in power, that they're not giving us the whole story. And we suspect that the truth, the whole truth, is hidden from us. And maybe it's hidden from us from like people in power who don't want to tell us the truth. Or I think more likely, it's just hidden from us because the answers, the whole truth is really complicated. And so most of the time we just get partial truths. So if you want to start studying philosophy, if you're a beginner trying to figure out where to start reading philosophy, I have some advice for you. Maybe you're thinking about studying philosophy in college or university and you don't know if it's the right fit for you. Maybe you just want to study philosophy on your own and you're looking for resources. So I have some book recommendations that I'll get to at the end of the video. And before that, I have a few tips. First, I think the first thing to do is just pick up some philosophy and start reading. And recognize it's okay when you're reading philosophy if you find these books hard to understand. Even philosophy majors, graduate students, even philosophy professors find philosophy difficult to understand. We all struggle with philosophy. And I think philosophy is especially difficult for two reasons. First, philosophy attempts to get at the hardest, most fundamental questions. Like, does God exist? Does life have meaning? Why is there something rather than nothing? Like, why is there anything at all? So these are really hard questions. And second, philosophy doesn't take anything for granted. Even basic things that everybody seems to agree on, philosophy says, well, hold on a minute, let's think about that. So philosophy asks questions like, how do we know anything? Can we trust our own senses? How does language work? So even the basic tools we use to interpret reality and interact with the world, language, our senses, our thoughts, philosophy is often asking, well, how do these things work? And is the information they provide us reliable? So it's normal to be a little confused and disoriented when you're reading philosophy because it messes with your head. It forces you to question really basic things and to think about like really big things. One of my favorite philosophers is this guy, Thomas Hobbes, and he argues, he was an empiricist. So he argued that every thought in our head, everything we think, every idea enters our head through our senses. So we have to have a sensory experience of something first before we can think about it. And that's hard to believe, right? Because I can imagine like a watermelon with eyes, wearing a top hat, riding a hippopotamus with two legs. Like, I can imagine that. But Hobbes says, yeah, but you've seen all those things individually in the world and you're just all combining them into some weird picture. So Hobbes says you can't actually think of anything that you haven't first seen in the world. Now, by contrast, someone like Plato argues that our senses are extremely unreliable. And the stuff we can see and touch and perceive in the material world is actually less real than ideas in our head. This is part of the meaning of that cave allegory, right? The shadows on the wall are not the real things. They're just images of the real things. And Plato suggests that there are things that exist and that we can think about that we've never actually seen. Think about like the principles of mathematics. Like Like, think of a circle. You've never actually seen a real circle, right? Because every line, every shape in the material world is actually imperfect. So you've never seen something that's like perfectly round. But you can think about a circle, you can understand the properties of a circle, you can work them out mathematically. So somehow circles exist somewhere, just not in the world, which is weird. So this is just one example of the many ways in which philosophy will kind of mess with your head in the very best of ways. It'll change the way you see and think about the world around you. It'll change the way you think about yourself. It'll open you up to new ways of understanding the world. And I think the hope is these are more true or more accurate ways of understanding the world. So if you want to start reading philosophy, here are some book recommendations. I've already mentioned Plato. There are many dialogues by Plato that would be great to start with. Maybe the Apology or the Meno, but one I might recommend to you here is Euthyphro. The Euthyphro is good. If you're interested in something like Greek mythology, the Euthyphro might be a good place to start. In this dialogue, Socrates entertains the question of whether things are good because the gods love them, or whether gods love things because they are good. So this is a dialogue about the relationship of the gods to the mortal world. And it's also a dialogue about value, like how do we determine what things are good and why are they good. If you want a cool thought experiment, you might read Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Discourse on the Origins of Inequality, in which Rousseau imagines what human beings would be like outside the confines of society. What would we really be like outside the influence of politics and society and media? I think this is a question many of us have thought about at one time or another, and Rousseau gives us one of the most imaginative and fully developed answers to this question. He's really trying to figure out what human beings are by nature, stripped of all convention. What would we be like? And then I have a couple more modern suggestions. One, and this one goes well with Rousseau, there's an essay by a philosopher named Virginia Held called Non-Contractual Society, A Feminist View. And what Held does in that essay is she reveals that many of our institutions, much of our society, is founded upon this image, this myth, really, of a human being as an economic man, a contract signer. And Held demonstrates how contract signing, the language of contracts, is just pervasive in society. Think about how we talk about like the free market of ideas. Held says we think of ourselves primarily as like contractual beings, but we don't have to. And she says, what if instead we imagined a society with a different fundamental building block, that instead of a person who signs contracts, we imagined a mother? And how different would society look? Would all of our relationships, our social relationships, our family relationships, our political relationships, how different would these look if we didn't imagine everything as a contract? What if instead we took mother-child relationships as the fundamental building block of human community? Another work of philosophy that I think is short, relatively easy to read, is Thomas Nagel's essay, What Is It Like to Be a Bat? And in this essay, Nagel takes on the very famous mind-body problem. Like, do we understand our brains, our minds, to be purely a physical thing? Is it all just electricity and chemicals? Can you provide a physical explanation for why we think and feel everything? Nagel is skeptical of this, and one of the ways he demonstrates the problem with this line of thinking is by asking us to think ourselves into the experience of what it's like to be a bat. And he says that this exercise is actually kind of impossible, and the impossibility of the exercise illustrates something about the difficulty of actually understanding in an objective way subjective experience. And so we have a very hard time speaking objectively about what goes on subjectively inside someone's mind. Now, as I said, this stuff can be really challenging. If you want some tips for how you can get the most out of your time reading, how you can focus better, how you can comprehend and retain even really difficult material, I've got a video on that over here. I will see you there, and I'll talk to you soon.